There wasn't a seat for me at my own grandson's birthday party, I said quietly, though no one seemed to hear it. Or maybe they chose not to. And that was the part that stayed with me the most as I stood there in the middle of a backyard filled with pastel balloons and folding chairs arranged in neat rows, every single one occupied except for the space where my name should have been, a space that didn't exist, as if I had never been expected in the first place, as if the years I spent raising my son, supporting him through college, helping him buy his first home, rocking that same little boy, now 7 years old, through sleepless nights when he was just a baby, had all been quietly erased without announcement or apology. And yet I smiled, because that's what I've always done. I smiled and adjusted the small gift bag in my hands, the one with blue tissue paper peeking out of the top, the one I had picked out just yesterday after spending nearly an hour choosing something I thought Ethan would love, something thoughtful, something meaningful, the way I used to choose things for Daniel when he was that age, back when he still reached for my hand without hesitation, back before everything became scheduled, filtered, approved, or denied by Emily, who was now standing near the cake table in a crisp white sundress, laughing softly with two women I didn't recognize, her posture relaxed, her voice light, as if nothing at all was out of place. And when she finally noticed me, standing there, still holding that gift, still searching for somewhere to belong, she tilted her head slightly and gave me that polite, practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and said, "Oh, Margaret, you made it," as if my presence was a mild surprise, a detail she hadn't fully accounted for. And then, with a small shrug that felt almost rehearsed, she added, "Looks like we're a little short on chairs today. I'm sure you can just stand for a bit." And there it was, delivered so casually, so effortlessly, like a passing comment about the weather, but the words settled heavier than they should have, pressing quietly against my chest as I nodded, still smiling, because making a scene would have only given her something to point to later, something to twist, something to justify whatever version of me she preferred to present to others. So instead I stepped aside, positioning myself near the edge of the yard where the grass met the wooden fence, where I could see everything without being seen too closely, where I could watch as parents chatted comfortably, as children ran in circles with frosting already smeared across their cheeks, as Daniel stood beside Emily, his hand resting lightly on her back, his attention fixed entirely on her, not once scanning the space to notice that his own mother had nowhere to sit, nowhere to rest, nowhere to exist except in the margins of a celebration I had once imagined I would be at the center of. And for a moment, just a brief one, I wondered if perhaps it really had been an oversight, a simple mistake in counting chairs, a small logistical error that could happen to anyone. But then I saw it, tucked beneath the edge of the table near the gift pile, a folded place card with my name written in careful script, slightly bent as if it had been handled and then set aside, not discarded entirely, just removed, quietly, intentionally, and something inside me shifted then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle, steady realignment, like a picture frame being straightened on a wall after years of hanging slightly crooked, and I understood, with a clarity that didn't ask for permission or offer comfort, that this wasn't about a missing chair, it was about a missing place, and I had simply been the last one to notice. For the next hour, I remained exactly where I had placed myself, near the fence where the sunlight felt just a little too warm and the laughter carried just a little too easily, as if the entire afternoon had been designed to move forward without ever needing to pause for someone like me. And I found myself adjusting my posture every few minutes, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, not because I was uncomfortable, although I was, but because standing still for too long makes you visible in a way that invites questions, and I did not want questions, not from the other parents, not from the neighbors, and certainly not from Emily, who moved through the party like someone in complete control of every detail, her voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms, her hands gesturing lightly as she directed where the cake would go, when the games would begin, which children should line up first, and every so often, she would glance in my direction, not long enough to acknowledge me, just long enough to confirm that I was still exactly where she had left me, still quiet, still contained, still cooperating with a situation that no one had bothered to explain. And I wondered, briefly, if Daniel would notice, if at any point he would look past the decorations and the guests and see me standing there without a chair, without a place at the table. But each time I looked toward him, he was already occupied, laughing at something one of the fathers had said, checking his phone, or leaning in toward Emily as if she were the only person whose presence required his full attention. And I realized then that noticing is not something that happens by accident. It is something people choose to do. And in that moment, my son chose not to see me. And there was a kind of quiet finality in that realization that settled deeper than the missing chair ever could, because a chair can be added, a mistake can be corrected, but the decision to overlook someone, to let them fade into the background of their own family, that is something far more deliberate, far more permanent. And as the party moved into its next phase, with the cake being brought out and everyone gathering around the table, I stayed where I was, watching as the children sang, their voices uneven but joyful, watching as Ethan closed his eyes to make a wish, a small smile forming on his face before he leaned forward to blow out the candles. And I clapped along with everyone else, my hands moving automatically, my expression carefully aligned with the mood of the crowd, even as I noticed that there was no space made for me to step closer, no gesture inviting me into the circle, just a subtle tightening of the formation that kept me at the edge. And when the cake was finally cut and plates began to pass from hand to hand, I waited, not because I expected to be forgotten, but because I wanted to see if I would be remembered at all. And minutes passed, plates filled and distributed, children laughing with frosting on their lips, adults balancing paper plates and plastic forks, and still nothing reached me, not even by accident, until finally Emily approached with a small plate, holding it out with that same polite smile, the one that felt more like a performance than a kindness, and said, "I was not sure if you wanted any, but I brought you a small piece anyway." And I took it. Of course I did, because refusing would have required an explanation, and explanations would have created a scene, and scenes would have shifted the attention in a way that might have made her uncomfortable. And I had already learned that her comfort was the quiet priority of this family now. So I accepted the plate, thanked her softly, and took a small bite, the sweetness settling on my tongue in a way that felt almost ironic, because there is something about tasting something pleasant in the middle of an unpleasant truth that makes the contrast sharper, more defined. And as I stood there finishing that small piece of cake, I found my eyes drifting once more toward the table where the gifts were piled, where that bent place card still rested just out of sight for most people, but not for me. And I understood, with a calm that surprised even myself, that what had happened today was not a single moment, not an isolated oversight, but part of something that had been unfolding quietly for a long time, something I had chosen not to name until now. And standing there, holding an empty plate with nowhere to set it down, I began, for the first time, to pay attention in a different way, not as a mother hoping to be included, but as someone who had finally realized she had already been written out. By the time the candles had been cleared and the children had scattered toward the yard again, I had already begun to see the afternoon differently, not as a single uncomfortable moment, but as part of a pattern that had been forming quietly over the past few years, one that I had explained away each time it appeared, smoothing it over with reasonable excuses the way I had always done for the people I loved. And as I stood there with nothing left in my hands, I found myself replaying small moments I had once dismissed, moments that now felt less like coincidence and more like careful decisions made without me. Like last Thanksgiving when I was told dinner would be small and simple, only to later see photographs online of a full table, extended family, neighbors, laughter I had not been invited to share, or the Christmas before that when I was given a time to arrive that turned out to be hours after everyone else had already exchanged gifts, the wrapping paper already cleared away, the excitement already spent, and I had walked into a quiet living room where Emily had smiled and said, "We thought you might prefer a calmer moment," as if exclusion could be reframed as consideration if it was delivered gently enough. And there had been other things too, smaller, easier to ignore at the time, like being left off group messages, or hearing about family plans after they had already happened, or noticing that when decisions were made, my opinion was no longer something anyone thought to ask for. And each time I had told myself that families change, that roles shift, that children grow into their own lives and mothers must learn to step back. But standing there in that backyard, watching my own absence take shape in such a visible, undeniable way, I understood that this was not about growing apart. It was about being moved aside, deliberately and consistently, until there was nothing left to move. And what unsettled me most was not Emily's behavior, because in many ways she had always been consistent, always polite, always composed, always just distant enough to create a barrier that could not easily be named. But Daniel, who had once noticed everything about me, who used to call just to ask if I had eaten, if I needed anything from the store, if I wanted to come over for dinner, and now stood only a few feet away yet seemed farther than he had ever been, his attention directed elsewhere, his awareness narrowed to the life he had built with her, and I wondered when that shift had truly begun, whether it had been gradual, or if there had been a moment I had missed, a point where something had quietly changed and I had not recognized it for what it was. And as I continued to watch, I noticed how easily conversations flowed around me without ever reaching me, how people formed small circles that opened and closed without including me, how even when someone glanced in my direction, it was only briefly, as if acknowledging me too directly might require an action they were not prepared to take. And I realized then that being excluded does not always arrive with harsh words or obvious rejection. Sometimes it comes wrapped in politeness, in smiles, in small omissions that accumulate over time until they form something undeniable, something that cannot be dismissed once it is finally seen clearly. And as that understanding settled into place, I felt a shift within myself that was difficult to describe, not anger, not even sadness in the way I might have expected, but something steadier, something quieter, like a door closing without sound. And for the first time, I stopped looking for a place to step into and began, instead, to observe the space as it was, noticing who held power, who deferred, who decided, and how easily I had allowed myself to believe that my place within this family was secure simply because it had always been that way before. And as the afternoon moved forward, I remained exactly where I was, not out of uncertainty anymore, but because I was beginning to understand that sometimes the clearest way to see the truth of a situation is to stop trying to change it and simply watch what unfolds when you do nothing at all. As the party slowly began to wind down, with paper plates stacking up on the side table and parents calling their children over to gather their things, I remained where I had been for most of the afternoon, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I was no longer in a hurry to leave a place that had already made it clear I did not belong in the way I once had. And as I watched Emily move effortlessly through the final moments of the event, thanking guests, handing out small gift bags, making sure everything appeared thoughtful and well organized, I noticed something I had overlooked before, not in what she said, but in what she did not say, the way she never once introduced me to anyone, never once used the word mother when referring to me, only my name when it was necessary, and even then, it was brief, almost optional, as if I were an acquaintance who had simply stopped by rather than someone who had spent decades building the very foundation of this family. And I began to recall the first time I had felt that subtle shift, years ago, when Daniel had invited me over for dinner shortly after he and Emily were married, and I had brought a homemade casserole, the same recipe he used to ask for every Sunday, only for Emily to smile politely and say they had already eaten, that they were trying a new schedule, something that worked better for them. And I had stood there in their kitchen holding that dish, still warm, realizing that something familiar had just been replaced, without warning. And over time, those small replacements continued, traditions adjusted, visits shortened, conversations redirected, until eventually I found myself being informed of decisions rather than included in them. And yet I had accepted it, telling myself that this was simply how families evolve, that it was natural for a new household to form its own rhythms. But standing there now, with the remnants of a celebration being quietly cleared away, I understood that what I had mistaken for change was actually displacement, gradual and precise, carried out not with confrontation but with consistency. And as Daniel finally approached me, his expression relaxed, his tone casual, asking if I had enjoyed the afternoon, I looked at him for a moment longer than I normally would have, searching his face for any sign that he understood what had happened, any indication that he had noticed even a fraction of what I had experienced. But all I saw was comfort, the kind that comes from believing everything is exactly as it should be, and I smiled. Of course I did, because correcting him in that moment would not have changed anything. It would have only disrupted the version of the day he had already accepted as complete. So I told him it was lovely, that Ethan looked happy, that the decorations were beautiful, and he nodded, satisfied, as if my approval confirmed something important to him, before turning back toward Emily, who was calling his name from across the yard. And as I watched him walk away, I felt that same quiet shift settle deeper within me, not painful, not sharp, but steady and undeniable, like a truth that no longer needed to be questioned. And for the first time, I did not feel the urge to follow, to stay longer, or to find a way to fit into a space that had been carefully arranged without me. Instead, I simply set my empty plate down on the nearest surface, smoothed the fabric of my jacket, and allowed myself to stand there for one final moment, not as someone waiting to be included, but as someone who had finally begun to understand that inclusion is not something you ask for. It is something that is either given freely or quietly taken away. And now that I could see it clearly, I knew that whatever came next would not begin in that backyard, but in the choices I would make once I stepped away from it. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Even though the distance had not changed in over 15 years, the same streets, the same traffic lights, the same quiet stretch of road lined with maple trees that Daniel used to point at from the back seat when he was a child, counting them one by one until he lost track and started over. And I found myself noticing details I had not paid attention to in a long time. The way the late afternoon light fell across the dashboard, the faint sound of the radio playing a song I did not quite recognize, the steady rhythm of the turn signal as I waited at an intersection that seemed to hold me there just a little longer than usual. And for the first time, I did not rush through these moments. I let them unfold slowly, because there was something inside me that had shifted, something that no longer felt the need to hurry back to a place where I had been quietly pushed to the edges. And when I finally pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a few seconds, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking at the front door of a house that had once been filled with noise, with footsteps, with voices calling out for me from different rooms, and now stood still and orderly. Everything in its place, everything exactly as I had left it that morning. And I stepped inside, setting my keys on the small table by the door, the familiar sound grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and distant, like revisiting a memory that no longer belonged entirely to the present. And I moved through the house slowly, almost deliberately, noticing the small details I had overlooked for years, the framed photographs lining the hallway, Daniel at 6 years old holding a baseball glove too big for his hand, Daniel at 16 standing awkwardly in a suit before his first school dance, Daniel on his wedding day, smiling in a way that had once filled me with certainty that he was happy, that he had found someone who would build a life with him. And I paused there for a moment, looking at that photograph longer than the others, not because I was searching for regret, but because I was beginning to understand that happiness, at least the kind captured in a photograph, does not always reveal the full picture. And as I continued into the living room, I noticed the folder resting on the corner of my desk, the one I had not opened in months, containing documents I had once intended to review. Statements, property records, notes I had made after meeting with my accountant last year when we briefly discussed organizing my affairs, something I had put off because there never seemed to be an urgent reason to address it. But now, standing there in the quiet of my own home, that folder seemed to carry a different kind of weight, not heavy in a burdensome way, but steady, like an option I had not fully considered until this moment. And I walked over to the desk, running my fingers lightly across the surface before opening the folder and flipping through the pages, not reading every line, not analyzing every number, but allowing myself to see, clearly, what I had built over the years, what I had saved, what I still had control over. And it was not about the value written on those pages. It was about the realization that there were still parts of my life that remained entirely mine, untouched by the quiet decisions being made elsewhere. And as I closed the folder and set it back down, I felt that same calm clarity settle in once again, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just present, like a steady breath after holding it for too long. And I understood then that whatever had shifted that afternoon had not taken something away from me. It had revealed something I had not been using, something I had not needed to consider before. And now that I could see it, now that I could feel it settle into place, I knew that the next steps I would take would not be rushed, would not be emotional. They would be deliberate, quiet, and entirely my own. The next morning began like any other, quiet and measured. The kind of morning that once felt predictable in a comforting way, but now carried a different kind of stillness, one that allowed space for thoughts I had spent years setting aside. And as I stood in my kitchen preparing coffee, watching the slow drip fill the pot, I found myself moving with a deliberate calm, not out of habit, but out of intention, as if each small action deserved my full attention. And when I finally sat down at the table with my cup in both hands, I did not reach for the television or my phone the way I usually might. Instead, I sat there in silence, letting the events of the previous day settle into something clearer, something less emotional and more precise. And for the first time, I did not ask myself why it had happened, because the answer to that question had already begun to reveal itself, not in a single moment, but in the pattern I could now see stretching backward through time. And what mattered more now was not understanding their choices, but deciding my own. And as that thought settled in, I reached for the phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I had not called in quite some time: Richard Lawson, the attorney who had helped me organize my documents years ago. And I hesitated only briefly before pressing the call button, listening as the line rang twice before his familiar, steady voice answered, and I introduced myself, reminding him of our previous meeting, and asked if he might have time to review some updated matters with me. And there was no urgency in my tone, no indication of distress, only a quiet clarity that seemed to carry its own weight. And he agreed without hesitation, suggesting an appointment later that week. And when I hung up the phone, I felt something settle into place, not as a reaction to what had been done to me, but as a response to what I now understood needed to be done for myself. And the rest of the morning unfolded with that same steady rhythm. I organized the documents in the folder more carefully, separating them into neat sections, making notes where needed, not because I expected anything dramatic to come from it, but because I was beginning to see the value in knowing exactly where I stood, exactly what I had, exactly what remained within my control. And as the hours passed, I found my mind returning not to the image of the missing chair, but to the look on Emily's face when she spoke, that polite smile, that measured tone, the quiet confidence of someone who believes the situation is fully understood, fully managed. And I realized that confidence often grows in the absence of resistance, in the quiet space where assumptions go unchallenged. And I had provided that space for longer than I cared to admit, not out of weakness, but out of a belief that patience and understanding would eventually be returned in kind. And yet now, sitting there at my own table, with the documents laid out before me and the morning light shifting slowly across the room, I understood that patience, when it is met with indifference, does not create harmony. It creates permission, and permission, once given, is rarely questioned. And so I continued my work, not hurried, not anxious, simply focused. And by the time the afternoon approached, I had gathered everything I needed, placed it neatly back into the folder, and set it aside once more, not as something to be forgotten, but as something that now carried purpose. And as I stood to clear the table, rinsing my cup and placing it carefully in the sink, I allowed myself one final moment of stillness, one final acknowledgement of the shift that had begun, not in the backyard the day before, but here, in this quiet space where I could think without interruption, where I could see clearly without distraction. And as I turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the living room, I knew, with a certainty that did not need to be spoken aloud, that whatever came next would not be loud, would not be emotional, but it would be deliberate, and it would be mine. The appointment with Richard was set for Thursday morning, and in the days leading up to it, I did not rush to fill the time with distractions the way I might have before. Instead, I allowed the quiet to remain, because it no longer felt empty. It felt useful, like a space where I could finally see things as they were without the need to soften them into something more comfortable. And I found myself moving through my routine with a different awareness, noticing how often I had adjusted my behavior over the years to accommodate others, how often I had chosen silence over clarity, patience over boundaries. And while there was no regret in those choices, there was a recognition now that they had shaped a version of me that others had grown used to, a version that did not question, did not resist, did not step outside the role that had been quietly assigned to her. And as I sat in Richard's office that Thursday, the same office with its neutral walls and neatly arranged shelves, I felt none of the hesitation I might have expected, only a calm focus as I placed the folder on his desk and explained that I wanted to review everything, not because something had gone wrong, but because I wanted to ensure that everything was exactly as I intended it to be. And he nodded, asking careful questions, guiding me through each document with a steady professionalism that I appreciated more than I could express. And as we moved through the details, I began to see my life laid out in a way that was both simple and complex: assets, accounts, decisions that had once felt distant now taking on a clear and immediate relevance. And there was something grounding about that process, something that reminded me that while relationships can shift in ways we do not expect, the structure of what we have built does not change unless we choose to change it. And when he asked if there were any specific updates I wanted to make, I paused, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this was not a moment for reaction, it was a moment for intention. And I told him that I wanted to make adjustments, not drastic ones, not emotional ones, but deliberate ones that reflected the reality I now saw more clearly. And he nodded again, making notes, outlining the steps, explaining what would need to be updated and how it would be documented. And by the time I left his office, the folder felt lighter in my hands, not because it contained less, but because it now carried clarity, direction, and purpose. And as I stepped outside into the late morning air, I did not feel a sense of victory or relief, only a steady certainty that something important had shifted, not in them, not in the family I had once tried so carefully to hold together, but in me. And as I walked to my car, unlocking the door with a quiet click, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting to be included in something. I was deciding what would include me, and that difference, though subtle, felt like the beginning of something far more lasting than any moment of exclusion could ever be. The following week moved forward with a kind of quiet precision that I had not experienced in years, not because anything around me had changed, but because I had stopped expecting it to. And there is a certain clarity that comes when you no longer wait for others to correct what they do not even recognize as wrong. And so I continued with my days as I always had, grocery shopping on Tuesday morning, folding laundry in the afternoon, taking my usual walk around the neighborhood in the early evening when the air cooled just enough to make it pleasant. And to anyone watching, nothing about me would have seemed different, but internally, everything had shifted because I was no longer moving through these routines with the quiet assumption that I was still part of something larger that would eventually circle back to include me. Instead, I began to see my life as something complete on its own, something that did not need to be validated by invitations or acknowledgments that might or might not come. And it was in that space of independence that I began to notice something else, something subtle but revealing. The way communication from Daniel and Emily remained exactly the same: brief messages when it was convenient, occasional updates about Ethan's school activities, short phone calls that felt more like obligations than conversations, and not once did the topic of the birthday party come up. Not once did either of them mention the missing chair, the lack of space, the quiet exclusion that had unfolded so clearly. And that absence of acknowledgement told me more than any explanation ever could, because people do not ignore what they believe matters. They ignore what they have already decided does not require attention. And I found myself reading their silence with a clarity I had not allowed before, understanding that in their version of events, nothing unusual had happened, nothing worth revisiting, nothing that needed to be addressed. And that realization did not hurt in the way I might have expected. It simply confirmed what I had already begun to accept. And as the days passed, I made small adjustments of my own, not dramatic ones, not confrontational ones, just quiet shifts that aligned with the understanding I now carried. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute invitations that rarely came. I stopped offering help that was no longer requested. I stopped filling in the gaps that had once made everything run more smoothly for them. And instead, I allowed those gaps to remain exactly as they were, because I had come to understand that stepping back is not the same as being pushed away. Sometimes it is a choice, and sometimes it is the only way to see who notices your absence and who does not. And as I settled into that new rhythm, I found a certain steadiness in it, a sense of control that had nothing to do with changing anyone else's behavior and everything to do with my own. And then, about 2 weeks after the party, I received a message from Emily, brief and polite, asking if I might be available the following Sunday. They were planning a small family lunch, Something casual, nothing elaborate, and I read the message twice. Not because it was unclear, but because I recognized the timing, the tone, the way it arrived without reference to anything that had come before. As if the past could simply be set aside without acknowledgement and everything would continue, as it always had. And for a moment, I considered responding the way I normally would have, agreeing without hesitation, adjusting my plans, stepping back into a role that had become increasingly narrow over time. But instead I set the phone down on the table and let the message sit there unanswered for a while, not out of indecision, but because I wanted to respond from a place that reflected who I was now, not who I had been. And when I finally picked it up again, my reply was simple, measured, and entirely honest. I told her that I had other plans that day, which was true, even if those plans were simply to spend the afternoon in my own space, doing what I chose without consideration for how it might fit into someone else's schedule. And I wished them a lovely lunch, nothing more, nothing less. And when I sent that message, I did not feel guilt. I did not feel the need to explain or soften it further. I simply placed the phone back down and continued with my day, and in that small moment, I understood something that had taken me years to learn, that respect is not restored through confrontation alone. Sometimes it begins with a quiet refusal to continue participating in a pattern that no longer serves you. And as the afternoon light moved slowly across the room, casting long shadows against the walls, I sat there in that calm, steady silence, knowing that while they might not yet see the change, it had already begun, and this time, it would not fade quietly into the background the way I once had. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt steady and unforced, not because anything around me had changed, but because I no longer measured my place in the world by how often I was included in theirs. And there is a certain kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for acknowledgement that was never truly offered in the first place, and instead begin to notice what remains when that waiting ends. And I found myself rediscovering small parts of my life that had quietly been set aside over the years. Afternoons spent reading without interruption. Evenings where I prepared meals simply because I wanted to, not because I was expected to contribute to someone else's gathering, and conversations with old friends that felt easy and genuine, untouched by the careful balance I had once tried to maintain within my own family. And it was in those moments that I began to understand something I had overlooked for far too long, that belonging is not something that can be preserved by effort alone. It requires recognition, mutual care, and a willingness from all sides to maintain it. And when that willingness fades, no amount of patience can restore it on its own. And so I stopped trying to restore what had already been quietly dismantled, and instead focused on what still stood, what was still mine to shape and protect. And a few weeks later, when I received another message, this time from Daniel, asking if I might be free to watch Ethan one afternoon because they had an unexpected commitment, I read it with the same calm attention I had come to rely on, noticing the familiar tone, the assumption that I would be available, that I would step in as I always had, filling the space without question. And for a moment I considered how many times I had done exactly that, rearranging my own plans, setting aside my own time without hesitation, believing that this was simply part of being needed, part of being valued. But now, I understood the difference between the two, and I replied that I would not be able to help that day, keeping my words simple and respectful, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary. And when his response came, shorter than usual, a brief acknowledgement followed by a pause that lingered longer than any message, I did not feel the urge to smooth it over, to offer alternatives, or to reassure him that I would be available next time, because this was not about creating distance. It was about allowing space for something that had long been overlooked to finally become visible. And whether they chose to see it or not was no longer something I could control. And that realization, once it settled, felt less like a loss and more like a quiet return to something I had not realized I had given away. And as I sat in my living room later that evening, the soft light from the lamp casting a gentle glow across the familiar space, I thought back to that afternoon in the backyard, to the missing chair, the bent place card, the subtle way everything had been arranged without me. And I understood now that what had happened that day had not taken anything from me. It had revealed the truth of where I stood, and more importantly, it had given me the clarity to decide where I would stand moving forward. And there was a strength in that clarity, not loud, not forceful, but steady and certain, the kind that does not require recognition to exist. And as I turned off the light and prepared to end the day, I allowed myself one final thought, simple and complete, that they had taken my place without ever asking, and now, without needing to announce it, I had chosen to take it back in the only way that truly mattered, by no longer offering it where it was no longer valued.